They say the screams carried for miles. Summer 1462. You're an Ottoman soldier in what is believed to be the most unstoppable army on earth. You've conquered Constantinople. You've crushed kingdoms. And now you're marching into a small, fragile principality called Wallachia to punish a rebellious prince. It should take weeks, maybe days. Then you smell it. Death, rot, and something far worse, something your mind refuses to name. Your column slows. The scouts are no longer moving. And as you crest the hill overlooking the capital, you finally see it. A forest. But the tree are not trees. They're human beings. 20,000 of them. Your brothers, your comrades, suspended on wooden stakes, rising from the earth in perfect geometric rows, stretching farther than your eyes can follow. Some have been dead for weeks, swollen, blackened shapes barely resembling men. Others are still alive, still writhing, still screaming. Your Sultan, the conqueror of the Byzantine Empire, stares for a single moment, turns pale, and orders the entire army to retreat. What kind of mind creates this? And here is the part that should truly terrify you. This wasn't insanity. It was strategy, cold, deliberate, and horrifyingly effective. The story people think they know about Vlad the Impaler is a lie, not because it didn't happen, but because the truth is far worse. This is the brutal account of how one man weaponized suffering so precisely that he altered the course of empires. And by the time we reach the end, you'll understand that the real horror was never what he did to bodies. It was what he did to the human mind. So let's begin with the question almost no one asks. What breaks a person so completely that they become capable of something like this? The year is 1442. Vlad is only 11 years old. His father, Vlad II Dracula, Vlad the Dragon, has just made a bargain with the devil. Not metaphorical, a real man with a real name, Sultan Murad II of the Ottoman Empire. The terms are simple. Vlad II keeps his throne in Wallachia. In return, he hands over his two youngest sons as hostages, living insurance to guarantee his loyalty. And so, young Vlad and his brother Radu are torn from their home and delivered into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Not as prisoners in chains, but as guests in palaces where every smile hides a warning and every lesson is a weapon. Not as prisoners locked in chains, but as honored guests inside the palaces of Edirne and later Amasya. They were dressed in fine clothes, given tutors, military instructors, lessons in Turkish, Arabic, philosophy, even the Quran. On the surface, it looked like privilege. But here's the truth the history books quietly step around. This wasn't education. It was psychological warfare. From age 11 to 17, Vlad watched silently as his captors perfected the machinery of empire. He studied the way the Ottomans ruled through fear, how a single execution could be orchestrated not to punish one man, but to terrify an entire province. He learned that terror, applied with cold precision, could command obedience more efficiently than any army. And he learned something far more personal. He had no power. While his younger brother Radu adapted, thriving, even forming a friendship with the Sultan's son Mehmed, Vlad refused to bend. Ottoman court records describe frequent punishments for his defiance. Some accounts claim he was beaten, possibly tortured. The details have been washed away by time, but one thing is certain. Something inside him broke, or maybe something hardened. What modern psychologists might call a persecution complex began to take shape, fused with an obsessive need for control. But instead of collapsing under it, he channeled it. Every punishment became a lesson, every execution a study, every torture method another tool added to the arsenal he was quietly building in his mind. And then in 1448, after 6 long years, captivity ended. 17-year-old Vlad returned to Wallachia, only to watch his world collapse again. Within 2 months, his father was murdered by rival boyars. His older brother Mirsha was buried alive in the snow. Vlad was alone, surrounded by enemies, supported by no one. But this is where the story shifts. He didn't want simple revenge. He wanted reconstruction, to remake the world in the exact image of the trauma that had shaped him, to take everything the Ottomans had taught him about terror and refine it into something even they had never imagined. He just needed time. For 6 long years, Vlad lived in exile, watching, waiting, and sharpening every dark lesson carved into him since childhood. He plotted. He studied military strategy. He learned the art of political manipulation. And then in 1456, with the backing of the Hungarian crown, he seized the throne of Wallachia. The monster was about to awaken. If you're fascinated by the psychological breaking points that forged history's most feared figures, hit subscribe, because this is only the beginning of how a shattered boy became something far more terrifying than his captors ever imagined. Vlad's coronation feast in 1456 should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it became the blueprint for everything that followed. He summoned the Boyar families, the same nobles who orchestrated his father's death and buried his brother alive. Hundreds arrived in their finest clothes, believing they were there to swear loyalty to their new prince. The great hall glittered with decorations. Wine flowed, music played. Then in the middle of the celebration, Vlad rose and asked a single question. How many princes of Wallachia have you lived through? The older boyars boasted proudly, 7, 10, some claimed a dozen different rulers. They were bragging about their survival, their cunning, their ability to outlast any prince who dared sit on the throne. Vlad smiled. Then he gave the order. Every boyar who answered was seized on the spot. And here, his methodical mind revealed itself. He didn't kill them, not immediately. He divided them into 2 groups, by age, by strength, by usefulness. The older ones, the architects of his family's destruction, were taken outside the palace walls and impaled at once. Not swiftly, the stakes were driven in with meticulous care, avoiding vital organs so their deaths would stretch on for hours, even days. Their screams became the grim overture to what came next. The younger, stronger boyars, along with their families, were stripped of their noble silks and marched nearly 50 miles north to the shattered ruins of Panari Castle. There, Vlad offered them a choice that was never truly a choice: rebuild the fortress with their bare hands, or die. For months they dragged stones up the mountainside, step after brutal step. They worked until their palms split open, until their once lavish clothing turned to rags, until exhaustion dropped them to their knees. Most never survived the labor. Those who did were transformed into something hollow, obedient, and afraid. With this single act, Vlad didn't just punish his enemies. He erased the old nobility and replaced them with a new order, one bound to him by terror rather than loyalty. This wasn't simple vengeance. It was the deliberate dismantling of a power structure that had weakened Wallachia for generations. And hidden beneath every decision was a truth about Vlad's mind. He didn't merely demand obedience. He wanted to shatter a person so completely that obedience became their only possible instinct. But all of this, brutal as it was, remained domestic. These were Wallachian nobles. What Vlad did next would send shockwaves across empires. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same Mehmed who once shared Vlad's childhood halls, sent envoys to Wallachia demanding the annual tribute his father had agreed to pay. And as if that weren't insult enough, the Sultan ordered Vlad to present himself in Constantinople to renew his oath of vassalage. The envoys arrived expecting politics, negotiation, perhaps even diplomacy. What they received instead was a preview of hell. When they entered Vlad's court and refused to remove their turbans, a legitimate religious custom in Ottoman protocol, Vlad asked them, with unsettling calm, to explain their tradition. They explained their custom, probably relieved that Vlad seemed curious rather than offended. He listened, nodded thoughtfully, and then spoke the sentence that must have frozen the blood in their veins. I respect a man who honors his faith so completely. Allow me to help you honor it forever. With that, he ordered his guards to hammer the turbans directly into their skulls. It's the precision of the cruelty that reveals the mind behind it. He didn't kill them. No, he preserved them. He mutilated them in a way that was symbolically devastating and medically calculated to keep them alive long enough to crawl back to Constantinople. They became walking messages, staggering across the countryside, their screams carrying farther than any written declaration of war. When Sultan Mehmed received them, men he had sent in good faith, now permanently disfigured and half-mad from agony, he understood instantly that this was not the boy he once knew. This was something entirely new, a creation forged from Ottoman methods, sharpened into a blade the Ottomans themselves could never have imagined. War was no longer a threat, it was a certainty. But before the armies clashed, Vlad had more lessons to deliver. Here's the truth most people never grasp about impalement. It wasn't merely execution, it was engineering. The popular image, a stake driven straight through the torso, would kill a man quickly, and that, in Vlad's world, defeated the purpose. His technique was far more calculated, far more monstrous. According to surviving Ottoman reports and modern medical analysis, this is how it truly worked. First, the victim was laid face down. A stake, rounded at the tip, polished and oiled, was inserted through the rectum. But here is the critical detail. It was angled to miss every major organ and blood vessel. Then the victim was raised upright. From that moment on, gravity became the executioner. Over hours, sometimes days, their own body weight pulled them downward, forcing the stake slowly upward through the torso. The path avoided the heart, the lungs, the arteries. It was designed for maximum duration, not maximum damage. Some historical accounts describe the stake eventually emerging from the chest or shoulder, yet the victim remained alive, sometimes for 3 days. 3 days of breathing, screaming, choking, and begging. 3 days that turned every witness into a lifelong storyteller. 3 days that carved Vlad's name into the nightmares of an empire. Why this method? Because Vlad understood something that modern experts in psychological warfare now openly confirm. Prolonged suffering shatters the human mind far more deeply than quick death ever could. A beheading on the battlefield is horrific, but it's over in seconds. Impalement was a performance, a slow-motion descent into agony that stretched across hours, sometimes days, with screams rolling through entire valleys like drifting smoke. But the physical torture was only the beginning. The real brilliance, if one can use such a twisted word, was in the presentation. Vlad staged his victims like exhibits in a macabre public theater, in crowded squares, along major roads, outside city gates, anywhere the most people would see them. He understood that witnesses multiplied terror faster than soldiers ever could. One person who watched an impalement would become a storyteller. 100 witnesses became 1,000 terrified listeners. And Vlad refined the message with chilling precision. The stakes rose in strict hierarchy. Peasants, at the lowest levels. Nobles, elevated higher. Commanders and dignitaries. On the towering stakes that dominated the skyline, a grotesque ladder of suffering spelling out a single truth. In my world, everyone suffers exactly according to their rank. Some chronicles describe entire fields arranged in perfect geometric patterns, circles, spirals, even star-shaped formations. This wasn't senseless cruelty. It was a declaration of absolute control. I have so much power that I can shape human agony into order. A German pamphlet from 1462, propaganda, yes, but rooted in Saxon eyewitness testimony, claims that Vlad sometimes dined among the impaled, seated at a table while dying men twitched and groaned around him. Whether exaggerated or not, the message was unmistakable. Your horror does not move me. Whether that specific scene unfolded exactly as described is still debated, but the psychological message behind it is not. I stand so far beyond your understanding of human behavior that your horror cannot touch me. The Saxons, who had their own tangled history with Vlad, spread these accounts across Europe. They became some of the first mass-circulated horror stories on the continent, complete with crude woodcut illustrations that burned Vlad's reputation into the European imagination. But amid all the shock and propaganda, almost no one asked the real question. Was any of this actually working? Was terror truly a military strategy, or simply the indulgence of a madman with power? The answer arrived in the summer of 1462, and it proved that Vlad's methods weren't just effective, they were devastating. By early 1462, Sultan Mehmed II had reached his limit. Vlad hadn't merely refused to pay tribute, he had invaded Ottoman territory south of the Danube, launching brutal raids deep into enemy lands. In one campaign, he slaughtered more than 23,000 people, a number he recorded himself in a letter to the Hungarian king, categorizing victims by age and gender. Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who crushed empires before turning 21, decided to deal with Wallachia personally. That spring, he assembled an army of 160,000 to 90,000 men, even the lowest estimates dwarfing the entire military-age male population of Wallachia. This wasn't an invasion. It was designed to be an extermination. Vlad had perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 men, many of them poorly trained peasants. A conventional battle would mean annihilation. So Vlad chose the only battlefield where he had the advantage, the human mind. When the Ottoman army crossed into Wallachia, they found nothing. Villages abandoned, wells poisoned, fields burned to ash. Every scrap of food destroyed or carried into the mountains. Vlad had ordered his people to disappear into forests and cliffs, taking their livestock and supplies with them. The Ottomans marched into a dead land, and the real war was only beginning. The Ottoman supply lines stretched thinner by the day, and then the night raids began. These were nothing like ordinary skirmishes. Vlad had trained specialized guerrilla units, small, lethal groups of 50 to 100 men who slipped through the darkness like shadows. They struck Ottoman camps in the dead of night, killing sentries, setting supply wagons ablaze, releasing horses into chaos, all before the soldiers could even form a response. They targeted everything that kept an army alive: food, animals, ammunition. The goal was never to win a straightforward battle. It was to break the Ottomans from the inside, make them paranoid, sleepless, exhausted, and afraid of the dark. But Vlad's masterpiece came on the night of June 17, 1462. Captured Ottoman soldiers revealed that Sultan Mehmed himself was encamped near Targovishte, guarded by his elite janissaries. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opening, so Vlad led 10,000 men in what history now calls the night attack. Under a moonless sky, his forces infiltrated the enormous Ottoman camp with a single objective: kill the Sultan. Contemporary accounts describe near-supernatural chaos. The Wallachians wore stolen Ottoman uniforms and spoke enough Turkish to pass in the darkness. They lit tents on fire. They sent horses stampeding through the camp. They drove their attack straight toward the Sultan's pavilion. They came within yards of Mehmed himself. Some historians even believe Vlad and the Sultan briefly saw one another across the flames. A moment of silent recognition between two men locked in a death struggle. But the janissaries held the line, forming a living shield around their ruler. After hours of brutal, close-quarters fighting, Vlad realized the breakthrough would not come. He ordered a retreat, and his men vanished back into the night exactly as they had arrived: swift, silent, ghost-like. The Ottoman casualties on paper seemed small, perhaps 2,000 dead, but the psychological damage was beyond calculation. The greatest army on earth had nearly lost its emperor in his own camp. To a man they believed they could crush in a week, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, standing in the center of his own massive army, had just survived an assassination attempt by an enemy force that was vastly outnumbered, appearing from the darkness and vanishing like ghosts. Mehmed's commanders were shaken. His soldiers were worn down, half-starved, and still weeks away from reaching Constantinople. They were marching across a dead, burned-out landscape where every shadow felt like a threat. And then, at last, they approached the capital and saw what Vlad had prepared for them. No written account can truly capture what Mehmed's army witnessed on the road to Targoviste in late June 1462. But imagine it. You're an Ottoman soldier. You've been marching for weeks through scorched earth. You're exhausted, hungry, and constantly on edge from night raids that never seem to end. You haven't seen the enemy in days. They've vanished completely. That should bring relief. But instead, it feels wrong. It feels like a trap. Then the smell hits you. If you've ever smelled a dead animal rotting in the summer heat, multiply that stench by thousands. Then add the sweet, sickening odor of human decomposition, so thick you can practically taste it. And then you see the stakes. First one, then 10, then 100. And then you realize there is no end. They stretch across the horizon in every direction. Contemporary accounts claim the field of impaled bodies stretched nearly 2 miles long and more than half a mile wide. Modern historians still debate the exact number. Ottoman sources, likely minimizing the horror, say 10,000. Wallachian and Hungarian sources claim up to 20,000. The truth is probably somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 human bodies. But here's what truly chills your blood. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't random. The stakes were arranged with careful precision, geometric patterns, concentric circles radiating outward, rows aligned by height and position. Every detail was deliberate. Every body was placed with purpose. A message carved into the landscape itself. In some areas, the stakes formed shapes you could only recognize from higher ground. Perfect star patterns carved out of human bodies. Vlad had spent weeks, perhaps months, constructing this nightmare. He had captured Ottoman soldiers and local sympathizers during earlier raids and border clashes, keeping them alive for one single purpose: this display. Some corpses had been baking in the summer heat for weeks, swollen and splitting open. Others had been impaled recently, their bodies still fresh, and some, according to multiple accounts, were still alive. The Byzantine chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who interviewed eyewitnesses, wrote that the groans of the dying carried across the entire plain. Some victims had survived for days, their bodies slowly collapsing around the stake, too weak to scream, yet still painfully conscious. Even the Ottoman veterans, men hardened by sieges, executions, and endless war, began vomiting at the sight. Some refused to take another step. Others deserted under cover of night, choosing the risk of execution over marching through this engineered hell. And at the center of it all, towering above the sea of bodies, was the highest stake. On it hung Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman commander captured in an earlier encounter. His corpse, still dressed in the tattered remnants of his military finery, was positioned to face directly toward the route of the Sultan's approach. A personal message from Vlad to Mehmed. This is what happens to your finest men. Imagine what awaits you. Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had watched the walls of Constantinople crumble under his cannons, who had ordered massacres without blinking, reportedly stopped his horse and stared in complete silence for several minutes. Different sources give slightly different versions of what he said that day, but the most widely accepted account comes from Chalkokondyles. His words were simple, measured, and chilling. It is impossible to overthrow a man who can commit such deeds. A man who knows how to wield his power this way is a man of great worth. This wasn't praise, it was recognition. In that moment, the Sultan understood he was facing something he could not fully comprehend. A mind that had taken Ottoman methods of terror and evolved them into something even the Ottomans themselves could never replicate. And by then, the military situation was already collapsing. The Ottoman supply lines were overstretched. The scorched earth tactics had done their job. The night raids had shattered morale. Even Mehmed's most trusted commanders were urging him to retreat. But the forest of the impaled, that was the breaking point. It proved that this conflict could not be won with traditional strategy. Vlad wasn't trying to win battles. He was trying to break minds, and it was working. Within days, Mehmed ordered a full retreat. He left a contingent under Vlad's younger brother Radu to keep pressure on the prince. But the Sultan himself withdrew with the main army. The most powerful military force on earth had invaded a tiny principality with overwhelming numbers and been turned back not by superior weapons, not by fortresses, not by armies, but by psychological warfare. Vlad the Impaler had won. But the story doesn't end with victory. What followed reveals the real tragedy. That terror, however effective it may be, eventually destroys the man who wields it. You'd imagine that driving back the Ottoman Empire would make Vlad a hero across Christian Europe. And in some ways, it did. The Hungarian king praised him. The Pope applauded his defense of Christendom. But there was something they didn't understand. Vlad couldn't stop. The methods that crushed the Ottomans did not stay aimed at the Ottomans. He turned them inward, against his own people. By late 1462, he was impaling Wallachian merchants for price gouging, impaling boyars suspected of disloyalty based on rumors alone. The same terror that protected his realm was now consuming it. He was impaling entire villages for even the smallest offenses. The weapon he had forged to face a superior enemy had become the only tool he knew how to use. And with that, his political support collapsed almost overnight. His brother Radu, backed by Ottoman gold and Ottoman soldiers, presented himself as the reasonable alternative. Hungarian support evaporated as Vlad's increasingly volatile behavior drove his allies away. By November 1462, only months after his greatest victory, Vlad fled into Hungarian territory. And here comes the bitter irony. The man he trusted, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, imprisoned him. The charges are still unclear. Some sources claim Matthias forged letters to make Vlad appear as though he were negotiating with the Ottomans. Others argue that Vlad had simply become too dangerous, too unpredictable, even for his Christian allies. He spent 112 years in Hungarian captivity, not the brutal formative imprisonment of his Ottoman youth, but a comfortable house arrest. He married a Hungarian noblewoman. He had children. By all accounts, he behaved himself. But in 1476, opportunity returned. Wallachia had fallen into chaos under a string of weak rulers. Stephen the Great of Moldavia helped orchestrate Vlad's comeback, backed by Hungarian and Moldavian troops. Vlad reclaimed the throne in November 1476. He ruled for maybe a turn of 2 months. In December 1476 or January 1477, the exact date lost to history, Vlad was killed in battle against an Ottoman force near Bucharest. The details are murky. Some say he was killed by his own men, either betrayal or mistaken identity in the chaos. Others insist he was overwhelmed by Ottoman soldiers. What is certain is the aftermath. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople as proof. After everything he had done to the Ottomans, after all the terror he had crafted and unleashed, Vlad the Impaler ended his life as a trophy, displayed in the capital of the empire he had spent his life defying. After everything, the terror, the impalements, the calculated psychology of fear, Vlad's story ended not with triumph, but as a trophy displayed for ridicule in the heart of the very empire he had spent his entire life fighting. His severed head, preserved in honey, was sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople as proof of his death. His body, according to tradition, was buried at Pekin Snagov Monastery, on an isolated island in Romania. But when archaeologists excavated the site in the 1930s, the tomb they uncovered was empty. To this day, no one knows where Vlad's remains truly lie. So what do we make of this story? In Romania, Vlad is remembered by many as a national hero, a brutal but effective ruler who stood against overwhelming odds to defend his land. His statues stand across the country, and his face appears on souvenirs and tourist books. But beyond Romania, especially after Bram Stoker used his name to inspire Dracula, Vlad became a symbol of vampirism, darkness, and supernatural evil. And in a strange way, that mythology makes the truth easier to swallow. It lets us imagine him as a monster, something non-human, something safely outside ourselves. But the real horror is this. Everything Vlad did was human. Painfully, terrifyingly human. He wasn't born a monster. He was shaped by a world where power was built through fear, where survival demanded ruthless precision, where mercy was a weakness few could afford. And Vlad took those lessons and carried them to their logical, horrifying extreme. The forest of the impaled wasn't madness. It was psychology in action. The night attacks weren't chaos. They were micro strategy. Every choice he made was deliberate, calculated, and devastatingly effective. That is the part of history we struggle to face, because it forces us to confront a truth we'd rather avoid. Human beings, under the right conditions, can create horrors far beyond any myth. Ottoman. They were precision military strategy. Every impalement, every mutilation, every staged display of suffering, none of it was random. Each one was a calculated move in a far larger game. And here's the part that should unsettle you long after the story ends. It worked. Against impossible odds, using nothing but fear sharpened into a weapon, Vlad the Impaler pushed back an empire. He proved that terror, when engineered with ruthless intent, can achieve what armies, numbers, and steel cannot. The question isn't whether Vlad was evil. That much is unmistakable. The real question is far more uncomfortable. What does it say about human nature that such a method worked at all? And what other horrors, designed with the same cold precision, are still hiding in the shadows of history, waiting to teach us lessons we would rather never learn? Thank you, truly, for staying with us through one of history's darkest chapters. If this journey stirred something in you, curiosity, unease, or simply the desire to understand the world a little more deeply, we invite you to stay with us. Your likes, your comments, and your subscription, they're small actions, but they help us continue bringing these forgotten, unsettling, and important stories back into the light. So if you feel like it, tap that subscribe button gently, like closing a book at midnight, and come with us again as we keep uncovering the truths that history tried to bury. Good night, and thank you for watching.